Sometimes the world changes very quickly. A financial crisis, a political shift, a sudden conflict, a society that no longer feels the way it once did. And when these moments happen, they often feel sudden, unexpected, as if the world changed overnight. But some of the most important changes in history don't begin when they become visible. They often begin many years, sometimes decades before that. Quietly, gradually, underneath the surface. You've seen this before in nature. An earthquake, a city shaking in seconds, people running through the streets in confusion, buildings collapsing, a volcano erupting after years of silence, a tsunami turning ordinary life into chaos almost instantly. And every time it happens, the feeling is similar. Shock, confusion, disbelief. How could something this massive happen so suddenly? But the truth is, it didn't happen suddenly. For years, sometimes decades, pressure was building underneath the surface. Tectonic plates moving slowly, energy accumulating silently, forces interacting long before anyone could see the outcome. The earthquake was not the cause. It was the release. And in many ways, the world works like this too. The forces are always there, but most people only see the event. Very few ever see the forces underneath it. Think about how often modern events seem disconnected. An economic crisis in one country suddenly reshapes politics somewhere else. Technological change alters social behavior faster than institutions can adapt. Policies designed to stabilize systems create new pressures somewhere underneath. The modern world is deeply interconnected, but most people experience these pressures as isolated events. And without some way to connect them together, the world can start to feel fragmented, reactive, and difficult to interpret. That is why the TNBC Signal Framework was created, a practical instrument for identifying deeper connections, structural pressures, and interacting forces underneath the surface of events. Because when multiple systems begin influencing each other at the same time, the world can start to feel increasingly difficult to interpret. The framework is designed to help organize that complexity. It draws on decades of thinking across systems theory, economic history, geopolitical analysis, and complexity science, translated into a practical framework for understanding how the world changes over time. Not by reducing complexity to a single answer, but by giving that complexity a structure you can actually work with. In other words, to move from reacting to events, to recognizing the pressures building before those events emerge. What you're about to see is the only time we'll cover the framework itself. From here on, it simply runs underneath everything else. You don't need to remember every part of it. What matters is recognizing the pattern, because you'll see it applied from here on. In the world we're living in right now, in how the 1980s felt stable while deeper pressures were already building, in how similar dynamics shaped the 1930s, today's trade conflicts, and even the stories societies tell about themselves. Different contexts, the same underlying structure. For those who want to go deeper into the framework itself, the full methodology, concepts, and historical parallels are available as a separate reference, but you don't need them to follow what comes next. Because the core idea is simple. Events rarely happen in isolation. They emerge from deeper interacting systems and forces underneath. And once you begin seeing those structures more clearly, the world starts to make a lot more sense. Most of us experience the world through events, headlines, crises, political decisions, economic shocks, social conflict, and most of the time, the focus is immediate. What happened? Who is responsible? What does it mean right now? But the deeper question is often harder to see. Why are these things happening in the first place? Why do societies sometimes feel stable for years, and then suddenly begin to feel unpredictable? Why do institutions lose trust, even while they still hold power? Why do economies appear strong on the surface, while large parts of society increasingly feel pressure underneath? Why does more information sometimes lead to more confusion instead of more understanding? And why do solutions so often seem to create new problems? Most surface-level explanations treat these as separate issues. A political problem, An economic problem, a social problem, a technological problem. But reality rarely works in isolated pieces. Economic pressure influences political decisions. Political decisions reshape social behavior. Technology changes how people communicate, organize, and think. Social fragmentation changes how institutions function. Everything interacts. And when multiple systems begin influencing each other at the same time, outcomes become harder to predict. That's why so many modern problems feel confusing. Solutions in one area often create pressure somewhere else. Policies designed to increase stability can unintentionally increase fragility. More information can produce more confusion. More connectivity can create more polarization. Greater control can reduce flexibility. The problem is not that people lack intelligence or information. In many cases, the problem is structural. The systems themselves have become more interconnected, more complex, and more difficult to interpret through isolated events alone. Because events are visible, but the deeper structures shaping those events often are not. And without a way to connect events to underlying systems and forces, the world increasingly starts to feel random, even when the pattern was already there, waiting to be recognized. Most people try to understand the world by staying informed. News, headlines, social media, analysis, constant updates. It feels like keeping up with reality. And in many ways, it is. But it is mostly focused on what is immediately visible. A continuous stream of events, reactions, and interpretations. What we call noise. Not something to ignore, but the starting point. This is where we move beyond the noise, and where the TNBC Signal Framework comes in. From there, the framework begins by identifying signals, patterns, and tensions that stand out from the noise, not answers. Signals are the contradictions, tensions, changes, and recurring patterns that begin appearing on the surface of society. Rising polarization, declining institutional trust, expanding debt, increasing social fragmentation, escalating geopolitical tension. Individually, these can appear disconnected, but signals alone don't explain themselves. The next question becomes, which systems are producing them? Economic systems, political systems, social systems, technological systems? Because major societal change rarely emerges from one domain alone. Economic pressure reshapes politics. Technology changes social behavior. Political incentives alter institutions. The next question is, which actors are responding to those pressures? Governments, corporations, institutions, citizens, networks, external powers. Because systems do not act by themselves. People and institutions respond to incentives, constraints, opportunities, and fear. Then, which forces are intensifying underneath? Economic pressure, power concentration, declining legitimacy and trust, social fragmentation, narrative and perception dynamics, external geopolitical pressure. These are not abstract categories. They are the same underlying pressures that have shaped major historical transitions throughout history, whether societies recognize them at the time or not. And once those forces are identified, the next question becomes, what dynamics are emerging between them over time? What triggered the pressure? What amplified it? What constrained it? What outcomes are becoming more likely as a result? Because systems rarely fail instantly. Pressure accumulates. Incentives shift. Feedback loops emerge. Stability weakens gradually before change becomes visible. Finally, the framework asks, where does the system now appear to be positioned? Is stability strengthening or weakening? Is power becoming more centralized? Is momentum accelerating? Which direction does the system appear to be moving toward? The purpose is not simply to explain events after they happen. The purpose is to recognize structural pressures while they are still building underneath the surface. A useful way to think about the framework is as a movement from events toward structure. Most people stop at the visible event itself. The framework keeps asking questions underneath it. about signals, systems, forces, and direction. This process does not provide certainty, but it can provide structure. And structure changes what you're able to see, because once events become connected to deeper systems and forces, patterns that once appeared random can start becoming more understandable. And that changes the questions you think to ask. Let's now look at a mini example. Take the 1980s. For many people, the decade is remembered as a period of confidence, prosperity, optimism, and stability. Economies appeared strong. Western societies felt cohesive. The future still seemed unquestionably positive. But if you had been looking at signals underneath the surface, certain structural pressures were already becoming visible. Certain patterns were already emerging underneath the surface. These were not necessarily the dominant headlines at the time, but they were signals, and the framework would treat them as indicators of deeper structural change underneath the visible stability. In other words, societies can appear strong externally, while fragility quietly accumulates below the surface. The visible crisis often arrives much later, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later. But the underlying pressures were already there long before the release became visible. Someone using this framework in 1985 would not have predicted the exact form a future crisis would take. But they would have been looking in the right direction and asking very different questions than most. Once you begin connecting events to deeper systems and forces, recurring dynamics start becoming visible. Similar pressures appear across different societies. Similar incentives produce similar outcomes. Similar forms of instability emerge across different historical periods. Over time, frameworks shape what people are capable of seeing, and gradually, the world becomes more interpretable. Not simpler, but more understandable. You begin reacting less emotionally to isolated events and paying more attention to the deeper structural changes building underneath them. The goal is to better understand the systems and pressures shaping the world around you before they fully emerge on the surface. Most people experience the world through events, but events are often only the visible surface of deeper systems and forces underneath. The TNBC Signal Framework is an attempt to make those deeper structures more visible, to identify patterns, pressures, and trajectories before the surface gives anything away. Not to predict the future with certainty, but to better understand the forces shaping the world around us, because the forces are always there, long before they become visible. And once you begin learning to recognize them, the world starts to look very different. In the next episode, we'll apply this framework to a real-world case, and that's where it starts to make a lot more sense. This is the next big cycle, understanding how the world actually works.